It's heavy, isn't it? Confessing something like this feels like a weight in my chest, pressing down, making it hard to breathe even now, years later. I suppose that's why I'm finally doing it, trying to let some of this air out. You see, it all started with a creeping silence that settled into our home like a damp fog. Connor and we weren't yelling or fighting, not in the dramatic door-slamming way you see in movies. It was worse in a way. It was the silence after the music stops, the emptiness after the laughter fades. We had built this life, brick by careful brick. A beautiful house, yes, the one with the big windows overlooking the valley. It was supposed to be our sanctuary, our happily ever after made real. Remember how we picked out the paint together, argued good-naturedly about the gardenias versus roses, and spent hours choosing the perfect shade of oak for the floors? We were so synchronized then, like dancers who knew each other's steps by heart. But somewhere along the line, the music changed, or maybe we just stopped listening to it together. The steps became clumsy, the rhythm lost. He was still Connor, of course. The same strong jaw, the same crinkles around his eyes when he smiled, though those smiles became rarer, directed elsewhere, at work emails on his phone, at the television screen flickering late into the night. His touch, once a spark that could ignite a wildfire, became perfunctory, a brief brush against my arm as he passed, a peck on the cheek before slipping into bed, turning away, the vast expanse of the mattress a physical representation of the chasm growing between us. I tried, you know. God, how I tried. I'd suggest date nights. Remember those little restaurants we used to love, the ones with the checkered tablecloths and the cheap wine that tasted like sunshine? I'd plan weekends, away thinking a change of scenery might shake us loose from this inertia. But he was always tired, always busy, always preoccupied. His no wasn't harsh, but it was firm, a gentle closing of a door that I was desperately trying to keep ajar. It felt like I was talking to a wall, a beautifully sculpted, expensively dressed wall, but a wall nonetheless. And then there was George, Connor's son. From his first marriage. Yes, I know, complicated already, isn't it? He was different. He had this quiet intensity about him, like he was observing everything, feeling everything, just beneath the surface. He'd come over for dinner sometimes, a little awkward at first, navigating the polite distance between stepmother and stepson. But he was kind, genuinely so. He'd ask about my day, really ask, looking me in the eye, listening to the answer, not just waiting for his turn to speak. He noticed things Connor didn't anymore. The way I'd rearrange the furniture when I was restless, the new shade of lipstick I'd try, the slight tremor in my voice when I was feeling particularly unseen. He saw me in a way Connor used to, in a way Connor no longer did. It started with small things. A shared laugh over a silly meme George showed me on his phone during a strained family dinner. A conversation about a book, a real conversation, where we actually listened to each other's thoughts, not just waited for the pauses to fill them with our own. These moments were like little sparks in the pervasive gray of my days. Sparks of something. I didn't know what to dozen. I just knew they were brighter, and I was starting to gravitate towards the light. This quiet house, once a dream, was becoming a prison, and in the shadow of that loneliness, a flicker of something new was beginning to glow. This is the beginning, the whisper before the storm, and like a fool, or maybe just a woman starving for air, I leaned closer to hear it. It wasn't a sudden thing, this shift. It was gradual, like the slow creep of ivy up a wall, almost imperceptible at first, until suddenly, you realize it's taken over. Our conversations with George started to lengthen, to deepen. They moved, beyond polite small talk, beyond the weather and weekend plans. We talked about books, yes, but also about dreams, disappointments, those quiet anxieties that whisper in the dark hours. He'd tell me about his struggles with college, the pressure he felt from Connor to follow a certain path, the artistic yearnings he kept hidden, sketching in notebooks he quickly snapped shut if anyone came near. I listened, really listened, and in his vulnerability, I saw a reflection of my own. I started to look forward to his visits, not in a way that was consciously wrong, not at the beginning. I told myself it was just nice to have someone in the house who engaged, who didn't just drift through rooms like a ghost. Connor would be in his study, the door firmly closed, the glow of his computer screen seeping out from under the crack like some alien light. And George and I would be in the kitchen, ostensibly helping with dinner, chopping vegetables side by side, the rhythmic thud of knives on wood a counterpoint to the unspoken language that was developing between us. It was in the glances. Those fleeting moments when our eyes would meet, and something would hold, just for a beat too long. A flicker of understanding, of shared emotion that felt charged, like static electricity building up before a storm. And in the silences, too, the comfortable silences that weren't empty, but full of unspoken things, feelings that hummed beneath the surface. We started finding reasons to be near each other, offering him a drink when Connor was busy, asking for his help with something in the garden, lingering a moment longer than necessary as I handed him a plate at the table, my fingers brushing his. Each touch, accidental or not, sent a jolt through me, a confusing mixture of guilt and something else, something undeniably akin to excitement. I remember one afternoon, it was raining, one of those soft, persistent rains that turns the world gray and muted. Connor was away on a business trip, another one. The house felt particularly large, particularly empty. George was there, helping me fix a leaky gutter, his hair damp, droplets clinging to his eyelashes. He came inside, shaking the rain from his jacket, and I offered him a towel. Our hands brushed as I gave it to him, a simple, innocent touch, but the air in the room seemed to thicken, to vibrate. We ended up in the living room, by the fireplace, a fire crackling against the chill. We were talking about music, I think. Something about his favorite band, and he was animated, passionate, his eyes bright despite the gloomy day. And then, it happened. It was so subtle, so gradual, I almost didn't realize it until it was happening. He leaned closer, to show me something on his phone, I think, and his arm brushed mine on the sofa. That static charge again, but stronger this time. My breath hitched. And then, he didn't pull away. He stayed there, just a fraction of an inch, closer than necessary. And in that space, that tiny, charged space, everything changed. It was as if an invisible line had been crossed, a boundary we both knew we shouldn't approach. Yet here we were, standing right on the edge, looking over, the temptation shimmering below. And in that moment, the unspoken language became something else entirely. Something dangerous. Something desired. The glimmer was intoxicating. That's the only word for it. After years of muted grays, of emotional starvation, George's attention, his interest, it was like sunlight breaking through clouds. I knew intellectually that it was wrong. Terribly, terribly wrong. He was Connor's son. This wasn't just some casual flirtation. It was a betrayal on so many levels, a fracturing of the very foundation of the family. The guilt was a constant companion, a dull ache in my stomach, a tightening in my chest whenever Connor was around, oblivious, trusting. But the guilt, as potent as it was, couldn't entirely extinguish the glimmer. Those stolen moments, those lingering glances, they became a lifeline, a secret world we inhabited in the shadows of our everyday lives. We started texting. Inane things at first, about movies, about music, about the ridiculous squirrels in the garden. But the texts became longer and more personal, venturing into the territory of feelings, of vulnerabilities. "How are you really?" He'd text, late at night when I was ostensibly reading in bed, Connor snoring softly beside me, miles away in his world, and I'd find myself pouring out my loneliness, my frustrations, the sense of being invisible, unheard, and he heard me. He'd respond with words that were like balm to my soul, validating my feelings, acknowledging my pain, and offering a kind of empathy that was utterly absent from my marriage. We met. Accidentally, of course. At the local bookstore, pretending to browse different sections, our eyes met across the crowded aisles, a silent acknowledgement passing between us. We'd talk briefly about books. Again, always books, the socially acceptable facade we carefully constructed. But the air around us crackled with unspoken tension, the thrill of the forbidden, the danger of discovery. These encounters, as brief and ostensibly innocent as they were, became charged with a deeper meaning. They were fuel for the fire, feeding the forbidden connection that was growing stronger with each passing day. I tried to pull back. I did. The guilt was becoming suffocating, the fear of exposure a constant shadow looming over me. I told myself it had to stop, that I was playing with fire, that I was going to destroy everything. I avoided being alone with George, made excuses to cut our conversations short, and tried to redirect his attention toward Connor, family activities, and anything to create distance. But it was like trying to hold back a tide with my bare hands. The pull was too strong, the need for connection too profound. And George? He wasn't pulling back either. If anything, he was leaning in. His texts became more frequent and more intimate. His glances lingered longer, bolder. He started seeking me out, finding reasons to be near me, his presence becoming a constant, alluring temptation. He'd find me in the garden, just admiring the roses, he'd say, his eyes fixed on me, not the flowers. He'd offer to help with chores around the house, always finding ways to be in the same room, the same space. And in those close proximities, the unspoken language intensified, becoming almost unbearable, a silent scream of longing and desire. The glimmer was becoming a flame, consuming the fragile walls of my resistance. And in the heart of that flame, guilt and desire warred, tearing me apart, even as they bound me closer to the inevitable conflagration. This feeling, this pull. It's a place many of us have found ourselves in, haven't we? That confusing mix of longing and knowing you're stepping into dangerous territory. If you're connecting with my story and these complicated emotions, make sure you're subscribed. We explore stories just like this on new infidelity stories every day, delving into the messy, real parts of relationships and human connection. Don't miss out on the rest of my confession. Hit subscribe now, and let's continue this journey together. It happened on Connor's birthday. A cruel twist of fate, or maybe just the inevitable culmination of all the unspoken desires and suppressed guilt. We were having a small family dinner, just the three of us. A forced intimacy, a charade, of normalcy that felt increasingly suffocating. Connor, as usual, was preoccupied, answering work calls even at the table, his attention fragmented, his presence distant. George was different that night, more intense, more present. His eyes kept finding mine across the table, a silent conversation passing between us that Connor remained oblivious to, lost in the labyrinth of his disconnected world. There was a nervous energy about him, a tremor in his hands as he reached for his water glass, a heightened awareness that mirrored my own. The air in the room was thick with unspoken words, with feelings that threatened to spill over, to shatter the fragile veneer of civility we were desperately trying to maintain. After dinner, Connor retreated to his study again. "Just a few emails," he said, the familiar refrain that had become a constant background hum in our lives. And George and I were left alone in the living room, the silence after Connor's departure charged, electric. We started clearing. The table, moving around each other in the constrained space, the unspoken tension palpable. And then it happened. Again, not a grand, dramatic gesture, but a quiet, devastating unraveling. I was carrying a stack of plates to the kitchen, and George was behind me. I stumbled, just slightly, my heel catching on the edge of the rug, and he reached out, instinctively, to steady me. His hand on my arm, firm and warm, and in that brief touch, something snapped. Years of unspoken longing, months of suppressed desire, and weeks of escalating tension, all coalesced in that single moment of physical contact. Turned to thank him, my heart pounding in my chest, and his face was close, too close. His eyes, dark and searching, met mine, and in them I saw everything. The unspoken desire, the shared longing, the forbidden knowledge that had been simmering between us for so long. And then he leaned in, just a fraction, his gaze locked on my lips. And I didn't pull away. I couldn't. It was like gravity, an irresistible force pulling me towards him. And we kissed. A soft, hesitant kiss at first, then deepening, becoming more urgent, more desperate. A kiss that tasted of both longing and guilt, of desire and destruction. And then the study door opened. The click of the latch, sharp and loud in the charged silence of the room, was like a gunshot. Connor stood there, in the doorway, his face a mask of disbelief, of confusion, slowly morphing into something darker, something wounded, something betrayed. His eyes moved from George to me, back to George, the dawning realization spreading across his features like a stain. The world seemed to tilt, to spin, to shatter around me. In that single frozen moment, everything I had tried to contain, to conceal, was exposed, laid bare in the harsh light of Connor's shattering gaze. The ashes of exposure, of betrayal, were beginning to fall, coating everything in their bitter, suffocating dust. The aftermath was chaotic, like a storm ripping through everything we had built, leaving behind debris and destruction. Connor didn't yell, not at first. His voice was low, dangerously calm, laced with a chilling disbelief. "What? What is this?" he asked, his gaze fixed on George, then shifting to me, a silent plea for explanation, for denial, anything to make sense of the impossible scene he had just witnessed. I couldn't speak. Guilt choked the words in my throat. Shame burned in my cheeks. George, to his credit, stepped forward, taking the brunt of Connor's initial fury. He tried to explain, to apologize, a jumble of incoherent words that only seemed to fuel Connor's rage. And then the yelling started, not directed at me, not initially. It was all aimed at George, a torrent of anger, of betrayal, of paternal fury unleashed. I stood there, frozen, a silent spectator to the unraveling of my life, my choices echoing. In the sudden, violent eruption of Connor's pain, the details are blurry now. Fragments of shouting, doors slamming, tears streaming down my face, George leaving, his face pale, stricken, Connor's voice, raw with hurt and anger, accusing, dissecting, condemning. The marriage, already fragile, shattered completely in those brutal hours. There was no going back, no repairing the irreparable damage. The house, our beautiful house, became a battleground, then an empty shell. I lost both of them in the end. Connor, of course. The divorce was swift, cold, devoid of any of the warmth or connection we had once shared. He moved out, taking with him not just his belongings, but also the remnants of our shared history, leaving me alone in the echoing emptiness of the house that had become a tomb. And George, he disappeared. He didn't answer my calls or my texts. He vanished from my life as completely as if he had never existed. Whether it was shame, guilt, or Connor's anger that drove him away, I don't know. Perhaps a combination of all three. It's quiet now. Too quiet. The silence in the house is different from before. It's not the silence of emotional distance, but the silence of absence, of loss. And in that silence, I hear the echoes of my choices, the whispers of regret, the heavy weight of what I've done. I understand now. The glimmer wasn't sunlight, but a dangerous spark in the darkness. The connection, born of loneliness and nurtured in secrecy, was built on a foundation of betrayal, destined to crumble. The lesson, harsh and painful, has been learned. That seeking solace in forbidden places only leads to deeper shadows. That true connection requires honesty, respect, and a commitment to the vows we make. It's not a beautiful story, is it? No heroics, no triumphant return. Just ashes and echoes and the quiet, persistent weight of regret. But perhaps in the stark emptiness of this ending, there's space for something new to begin. Perhaps in the next chapter, the silence can become a different kind of quiet. A quiet where healing can begin, where lessons can take root, and maybe, just maybe, where a different kind of light can eventually find its way in. This is the end of this chapter, but not perhaps the end of the story. Thank you for listening to me. Did you like these infidelity stories? Drop a comment below if you want part 2. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for more cheating wife stories.